this. You guys just doing it out of the goodness of your heart, and it's available on Realm. I know my wife and I missed a couple of weeks ago, and we were able to watch that one. It was very, very helpful that you guys filmed. So thank you very much. And I'd just like to welcome everyone and hold us up with prayer. Pray with me. Lord, thank you for this day. Thank you for what you've given us. You're the King.
Yes.
We worship a mighty King.
Yes.
Help us not forget that. You're the maker of heaven and earth. And Lord, I pray you'll point our eyes towards you as we hear this message today.
Yes.
Take the scales off our eyes.
Yes.
Renew our hearts. Help us to welcome information. Help us to be open to show us the ways that maybe the way we've thought in the past hasn't been right or effective or in your eyes holy and good. But Lord, may you bless this time. I pray for Damon. I pray that he will give him wisdom
Yes, Jesus.
and give us hearts to receive. Lord, and may you be glorified. May Satan be horrified.
Yes. Yes. Yes.
As we proceed. I bless this time. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
I like that spoken word.
Yeah.
God glorified.
Satan horrified.
I have to slow down to even say that. All right. Well, let's begin today in a place where we spent a lot of time. I want us to remember Genesis 1, verse 26. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." So I'm going to stop there and just say thank you for being here today. I think that they put the fire marshal maximum number of chairs in the room, and we'll just see how that goes. Right now, though, I'm very cold, so it's kind of good because I'm hoping that your body heat will kind of come to me,
I'm sweating.
and I'll feel it. Okay. So last week we talked about this idea of white trauma, and the thought that sometimes in our discussion around issues of race, I'm going to say the minority culture. The minority culture sometimes has feelings of shame or denial, sometimes feelings that are very difficult to understand. And so I mentioned this idea of white trauma because the reality is sometimes those feelings are about what you've experienced, what the minority culture has experienced, things that you've seen that you perceived as inappropriate, borderline racist, disruptive, but you saw those from people that you love or respect or admire. And so it's kind of hard to move beyond that because you're thinking, this is a good person. This is a good person. And so today I want us to go a little bit further than that because last week we talked about it from kind of a historical and an institutional level. And we talked about redlining and some of the housing practices in the early 1950s, 1960s that really eliminated possibilities for African Americans especially to move beyond certain neighborhoods, and how that had an impact on not just where we live, but also where our kids go to school, the funding of those schools, the opportunities in those schools, because the property tax that oftentimes supports schools were less in those areas. And how it impacted the move from poverty to some level of wealth, because there was no accumulation of wealth. It was, you're in a depressed area, there's no way to move out of that, because you have a substandard education, your property has no value, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It can go on and on and on and on. So one of the things that we didn't talk about last week, and I just want to touch on this briefly, we did not talk about kind of the institutional racism as it pertains to church. Did I say something? And it wasn't that I was trying to avoid it. We ran out of time, as we often do. But Jeff was sitting in the back of the room, and he heard our conversation, and he brought me a book, which he's probably not going to get back. I'm gonna conveniently lose it or misplace it or something. But there's a passage in here I want to read you, and I'm going to tell you before I read it. It actually is about a person that I kind of consider a hero. So the first time I read it, I was mad, and then the second time I read it, I was a little bit madder, and then I kind of backed off of being mad. Then I also want to tell you, it's about Billy Graham, and he died this week. And I've always loved Billy Graham. I was a big part of the crusade when it came to Nashville back in 2000, whatever year that was. Was it in 2000? In 2000? I was a big part of that crusade, and just the whole organization of it, and the follow-up. So what I had to then wrestle with was Genesis 1:26, and that becoming like God, that made in his image, that we begin to reflect more and more and more. And I found myself then wrestling, but hopefully giving up some that grace to Billy Graham. Graham began a series of wavering actions on the race issue. In 1952, he held desegregated meetings in Washington, D.C. A few weeks later in Houston, he accepted the local organizers' segregated seating terms. So even he's kind of struggling. A short time later, he again held segregated meetings in Mississippi, but defied the governor's request for separate services. At the meetings, he criticized segregation, but when this upset white Southerners, he told the local newspaper, "I feel that I have been misrepresented on racial segregation. We follow the existing social customs in whatever part of the country in which we minister. As far as I have been able to find in my study of the Bible, it has nothing to say about segregation or non-segregation. I came to Jackson to preach only the Bible and not to enter into local issues." The following year in Chattanooga, Graham requested that the services be desegregated. When denied, he personally moved the ropes marking the black section. But a few months later in Dallas, he again accepted segregated meetings. So he's really struggling. He's really struggling. After the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, Graham no longer permitted any form of enforced segregation at his meetings, and in 1957, he began attempting to integrate his own organization racially. He even had Martin Luther King come to say an opening prayer at a crusade meeting in New York that year. But Graham could not accept the methodology of Martin Luther King and the civil rights movement, having a deeper, I can never say this word, abhorrence. Did I get it out okay? Okay. For public protest and favoring a gradualist approach to integration. He also did not believe in working to change laws, as he sincerely believed that laws could not change wicked hearts. To understand this, we must account for the premillennial view that had come to dominate the American evangelical worldview and played a role in limiting evangelical action on race issues. According to this view, the present world is evil and will inevitably suffer moral decline until Christ comes again. Thus, to devote oneself to social reform is futile. The implications of this were clearly expressed by Billy Graham. In response to King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, that his children might one day play together with white children, Graham, who had been invited but did not attend the 1963 March on Washington, said, "Only when Christ comes again will little white children of Alabama walk hand in hand with little black children." This was not meant to be harsh, but rather what he and most white evangelicals perceived to be realistic. Yeah, that is pretty heavy. And I think most of you probably know that if we look at our own flavor, there are similar stories as well. So I want to be clear about that Billy Graham still is one of my heroes. But I think from an institutional standpoint, I think sometimes we bristle at the idea that this non-organic institution or this non-organic thing could somehow perpetuate such harsh and hateful behaviors. But that's where that cultural identity that we talked about at the beginning of the class comes in. Because those institutions that we are familiar with, a part of, grow up in, learn from, they also help define our cultural identity. And so we become the organism by which these messages are disseminated. I don't know Billy Graham's past, but I bet if you go back and back and back, this was not something that was completely skewed from where he came from. And that's our challenge today. It's realizing that there are parts of this that are just part of my past. The question is, how am I going to respond to it? I'm going to probably say this about 100 times today, and just forgive me if I do. Those kids in Florida who are speaking out about guns, they are using their privilege
Amen.
in
Yes.
ways that I don't think, have ever seen in this country.
Yes, yes.
And they're black, they're yellow, they're white, they're maybe green, I don't know. But because their institution, their school has pushed them to a place to understand the importance of voice and people, the importance of choice and action, they're speaking in a way that's making people back down. People are backing down. That's what this conversation is about. And it's not a conversation that we have to move from here to, another camera and a news station, but it is a conversation that we can have in our home. It's a conversation that we can have in our neighborhood. It's a conversation that we can have with our children. So I want to leave the institutional side of it because I think we talked about that, unpacked that enough last week. And I want to go to then what is the personal side? How does white trauma, how does this idea of white trauma affect us on a personal level? And I want to show you 2 videos. I'm a teacher, so if you're wondering, why does he always show videos? Hold on, let me go back to the camera. Snippets of videos, not the whole video, snippets. So if you wonder why I'm always showing you videos, because, sometimes art has a way of teaching us that words just can't. So I'm gonna have to do a little preface here because some of y'all are way too young. Is that better when it's back further?
Yeah.
Some of y'all are way too young and you don't know Archie Bunker. Gosh, I don't know